This next section, starting with chapter 30, continues again the theme of Lady Catherine de Bourgh as being something of a dragonish character. And as it says here in the text, though this great lady was not in commission of the peace of the country, she was a most active magistrate in her own parish, the minutest concerns of which were carried to her by Mr. Collins, and whenever any of the cottagers were disposed to be quarrelsome, discontented, or too poor, she sallied forth into the village to settle their differences, silence their complaints, and scold them into harmony and plenty. The entertainment of dining at Rosings was repeated about twice a week, and allowing for the loss of Sir William and there being only one card table in the evening, every such entertainment was the counterpart of the first. Lady Catherine goes around the territory constantly, almost like a dragon surveying his lands, and doesn't give money to the poor or take care of them or help build houses. She simply scolds people into further plenty and happiness. So there's a comic element to this. She's not a tragic figure of a dragon. She's a comic dragon. But nevertheless, she is invasive, she is abusive, she is bullying, she's full of herself. She lords over her domain like a dragon lords over his treasure or his land. And added to that, we notice here that Mr. Collins is in some ways her toady. He grovels before her. He has an element of him that's not just comic, but has a possibility of being very cruel because he serves this dragon lady, and he has put himself completely under her power. Well, going to Rosings then becomes almost a chore. Notice that they're invited twice a week. Collins originally had said that it was such an honor to be invited to Rosings. We only go there occasionally. But they're invited twice a week, which means either that Lady Catherine's wanted to keep a close eye on Elizabeth, possibly, but it might also mean that Lady Catherine frequently invites Collins and his wife to dine, and Collins continuously says, it's such an honor, even though it happens all the time. Well, we notice in the text right after that, to kind of develop a pathetic side to Collins, it says, their other engagements in town were few, as the style of living in the neighborhood in general was beyond Mr. Collins's reach. To put it another way, Collins doesn't go anywhere else besides his own house and Rosings. He doesn't know anybody in town. He's a parish priest, but he never is invited to any dinners at anybody's house. So it's just him and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Well, Lady Catherine then has a nephew who is Darcy. Darcy is the nephew of Lady Catherine. We have to consider that Darcy, growing up in a family of such tremendous wealth and a woman of such tremendous pride as Lady Catherine, he would have had to be constantly on his guard, and that's exactly what we see when he finally does come to Rosings. It gives us a real insight into the poor man, that he would have had to grow up with Lady Catherine constantly there belittling him and berating him. As it says here in the text, Lady Catherine, who talked of Darcy's coming with the greatest satisfaction, spoke of him in terms of the highest admiration, and seemed almost angry to find that he had already been frequently seen by Miss Lucas and herself. Lady Catherine admires Darcy, partly because he's so wealthy, he's the ideal of a gentleman, also because he's intended for her daughter, that Miss de Bourgh is intended to marry Darcy. Lady Catherine hopes that that will be the case, and from the time he was brought into the world, the time he was born, Darcy was slated to marry whom Lady Catherine intended him to marry. Well, if you look at Miss de Bourgh, she's quite a different character from Lady Catherine, but her smallness and her frailness is in some ways because she's so dwarfed by the immensity of Lady Catherine. And she becomes almost a comic figure of the opposite of what Lady Catherine is. We look back a chapter or two before and look at what the description of her really is. Miss de Bourgh is quite a little creature. Who would have thought that she could be so thin and small? She's abominably rude to keep Charlotte out of doors in all this wind. Why does she not come in? I like her appearance, said Elizabeth, struck with other ideas. She looks sickly and cross. Yes, she would do for him very well. She'll make him a very proper wife. Miss de Bourgh is sickly and small, where Lady Catherine is huge. And Elizabeth is kind of cheered by this idea that he's going to be marrying this sickly, small woman. And when Darcy does finally appear, he appears with another fellow named Fitzwilliam, who is the younger son of his uncle. And Fitzwilliam is a man who is very cheerful and outgoing, but doesn't have a lot of money himself. And he's immediately attracted to Elizabeth. And as it says here in the text, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who led the way, was about 30, not handsome, but in person and address, most truly the gentleman. Mr. Darcy looked just as he had been used to look in Herefordshire, paid his compliments with his usual reserve to Mrs. Collins, and whatever might be his feelings toward her friend, met with every appearance of composure. Elizabeth merely curtsied to him without saying a word. When Darcy and Fitzwilliam arrive, they don't go immediately to Rosings. In fact, they don't go to Rosings at all to visit Lady Catherine, which says a great deal about how Darcy relates to Lady Catherine. Instead, he goes and he visits Charlotte Lucas. And as Charlotte points out, he goes there because Elizabeth is there. Remember that Elizabeth doesn't notice yet that Darcy actually likes her. She thinks that he's horrible. She hates him. Her prejudice against him prevents her from seeing how good a man he could actually be, or from seeing that he might actually like her. And when he comes, he doesn't say much. You say, well, why doesn't he say much? Well, if you look at his relationship to Lady Catherine again, if you'd grown up with a woman who talked all the time, it may be that you would be very careful about what you said, and you'd be guarded in your words, and you wouldn't say much. And so his taciturn nature probably comes from the fact that he's been growing up in a family where this has been the dominant woman in the family. Well, when they go to Rosings for dinner that night, there's this comic scene that occurs between them all, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh keeps butting into their conversation. Her ladyship received them civilly, but it was plain that their company was by no means so acceptable as when she could get nobody else, and she was, in fact, almost engrossed by her nephews, speaking to them, especially to Darcy, much more than any other person in the room. And then further in the text, she says, "What is that you're saying, Fitzwilliam? What is it you're talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." Lady Catherine frequently interposes herself in the text. Here, she wants to hear what everybody else is saying. She wants to hoard conversations, and she sucks the life out of everybody. And again, I think that if you've grown up in a family where this was the type of woman who was dominating over you, it'd be quite frightening, quite awful. It would somewhat cause you to be much more quiet than you normally would be otherwise. Well, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who is again a foil to Darcy, is beginning to be attracted to Elizabeth. And that kind of reveals something of the possibility of Darcy's being attracted to Elizabeth. It also reveals the possibility that Darcy is a decent fellow, because if he has these friends like Bingley and Fitzwilliam who are decent, good men, one is known by the company one keeps. And so Darcy's company, these good men, reveal that he too is probably a very decent fellow. Well, when Fitzwilliam says we're talking about music, Lady Catherine barges in and says how much she's good at music, blah, blah, blah. She says, "Of music, then pray speak aloud. It is of all subjects my delight. I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learnt, I should have been a great proficient, and so would Anne if her health had allowed her to apply. I am confident that she would have performed delightfully." It's ironic that Lady Catherine says, I would have been great at music if I had ever learned. She hasn't learned. She doesn't play an instrument. But had she done so, she would have been the best. She is a classic example of swollen pride, of hubristic pride that just overpowers a person. So much so she thinks that she has to own everything, control everything. And she would have been the best at everything had she had the opportunity. And when she asks about Georgiana to Darcy, Darcy has to set the question aside, divert it, because he knows that the question is intended to try and ridicule and to poke holes at people. And so it says, Mr. Darcy spoke with affectionate praise of his sister's proficiency. "I am very glad to hear such a good account of her," said Lady Catherine, "and pray tell her from me that she cannot expect to excel if she does not practice a good deal." "I assure you, madam," he replied, "that she does not need such advice. She practices very constantly." So you see, Darcy himself has all his life had to deal with this dragon woman, and has to learn how to divert her questions and to thwart her attacks and turn aside her ridicule. So he's had to do it all his life. A very heroic thing, actually. A thing which I think takes a great deal of courage on his part. And Elizabeth, now being exposed to this for the first time, is getting an insight into what kind of man he is, because he's a man who's all his life had to live with this. That's why when later on he comes to talk to her, she says, "You mean to frighten me?" Right? Because she sees in him the same kind of frightening nature that is in Lady Catherine. And she says that I'm not afraid of you. She does it smilingly and is comical. But it's also an indication that she can stand up to him in the same way that she can stand up to Lady Catherine. She's not going to grovel like Collins, and she's not going to be bowled over like Maria and her father, for instance. Rather, she's going to be able to stand up to him. And Darcy reveals to her that he has always lived this way, struggling with these inability to do certain things and trying to look good and not being able to be honest with anybody. So their conversation is interrupted by Lady Catherine, and we end the evening then with all the people being glad to leave Rosings. But right after that, in chapter 32, there's an exchange between the two where Darcy barges in on the cottage, accidentally not knowing that nobody's there. And he sees only Elizabeth. He strikes up a conversation with her, and it begins to be revealed that he is falling in love with her. But he's surprised nobody else is there. They talk for a bit about various things, and he says something which is rather cryptic, strange. In chapter 32, he says to her, "It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighbourhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far." As he spoke, there was a sort of smile which Elizabeth fancied she understood. "I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family. The far and the near must be relative, and depend on many varying circumstances. Where there is fortune to make the expenses of travelling unimportant, distance becomes no evil." Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her and said, "You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. You cannot have been always at Longbourn." Elizabeth looked surprised. The gentleman experienced some change of feeling. He drew back his chair, took a newspaper from the table, and glancing over it, said in a colder voice, "Are you pleased with Kent?" It's interesting that what Darcy's doing here is when he asks her, "You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment," he's asking her, would you be able to move out of Longbourn? Would you be willing to move farther away, say, to my estate? All his life he's had to been guarded, contained, self-contained. Can't say anything for fear of being ridiculed by Lady Catherine, and so he's very cautious. It's one of the reasons why he's so taciturn all the time. And he's in love, deeply, madly in love with Elizabeth, and he's so contained, so tightly wound about this love, that he has to find out whether it's going to be returned or not. Were he to express his love, like Collins, and be turned away immediately by Elizabeth, it would be embarrassment, it would be ridiculous, it would be just absolutely mortifying, and he can't afford that. So what he's doing here is he's testing subtly, would you be willing to marry me and move away from your family? And she doesn't respond in the way that he expects, because, of course, she's not looking for this at all. And consequently, he puts back on the mask. He wears a mask again, and he becomes cold to her. But soon it's discovered that he visits frequently to the cottage to come see them. And even Charlotte begins to clue to the idea that maybe Mr. Darcy is deeply and madly in love with her friend, Elizabeth.